Just 80 days after becoming Prime Minister, Stephen Harper promised to put an end to, or managed to put an end to, tariffs on softwood lumber. But this Prime Minister caved in and allowed Donald Trump to reimpose those tariffs, and Mr. Biden doubled them. Stephen Harper entered into a deal with Barack Obama in order to avoid the consequences of the Buy America Act. Can we have an election so that Canadians could have a Prime Minister who will stand up for Canadians? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, what we see once again is the Conservative leader saying anything and everything. While we stand up against Donald Trump, we stood up against him when he wanted to renegotiate NAFTA, and it was the Conservatives, including Stephen Harper, who were encouraging us to back down and not offend the Americans. On the contrary, we stood up for ourselves. We protected supply management. We protected steel and aluminum workers. We protected Canadian jobs all across this country, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. This Liberal Prime Minister not only capitulated to Obama, Trump, and Biden, he also gave $500 million worth of investment that left this country, impoverishing Canadians in the process. Years ago, the New York Times said life in Canada has the wealthiest middle class in the world. And Canada seems to be outstripping even the U.S. Today it's the opposite. Canadians are poorer than Americans. Why is this Prime Minister creating jobs for Americans? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the opposition leader continues to claim that Canada's broken, but at the same time, he wants to get rid of the investments that will help Canadians, for example, with the construction of new homes. The millions of dollars that we've sent to the government of Quebec to build new affordable housing, if it was up to him, he would cut and impose austerity on Quebecers and all Canadians. They don't want that. We don't want that. We need to invest to help alleviate the housing crisis, and that not the kind of policies the opposition leader is proposing.
Minister Stephen Harper only 80 days to get a softwood lumber deal that put an end to the tariffs and reimbursed what were already collected. And then this Liberal Prime Minister capitulated, allowed Trump to reimpose the tariffs and Biden to double them. Harper got us an exemption to Buy America. This Prime Minister then capitulated, allowed Trump and Biden to reimpose them, hurting our construction workers and our providers of steel. Why can't we have a carbon tax election so that we can have a Prime Minister that no longer capitulates to the Americans, but instead will stand up for Canada?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, since I just answered that question in French, allow me instead to take a moment to condemn unequivocally the violence we've seen in South Asian communities across the country over the past few nights. Let me be very, very clear. The individuals who are inciting violence and division and hatred in no way represent either the Sikh community or the Hindu community in Canada. At a time of Diwali, Bandi Chor Divas, we're seeing communities come together to celebrate their diversity and their strength. We will continue to stand for the unity of Canadians.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The New York Times 10 years ago. Life in Canada, home of the world's most affluent middle class. Median income in Canada appears to have surpassed median income in the United States. Oh, what a decade can do. Now, American workers make almost $20,000 more than their Canadian counterparts. They get twice as much investment every single year. The gap between our per capita GDP and that of the United States is now the worst in a century after this Prime Minister's rising taxes, bureaucracy, and blocking of energy projects. I know why Harris and Trump want to create jobs for Americans, but why does this Prime Minister want to help them?
Right.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the silence of the Conservative leader is deafening when it comes to what's happening in the South Asian communities right now. And it's a real shame. Not only is he not stepping forward to talk about how all Canadians must stand together and all South Asian Canadians, Sikh, Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, are celebrating together this weekend, but he even refuses to take the issue seriously enough to get the security clearance necessary to be briefed on threats to Canada and to Canadians. That's not leadership, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Now you know his real agenda. He wants to distract from all the economic misery he's called at home. And so he uses divisions here at home. These divisions are the result of him. Under his leadership, we've seen a 251% increase in hate crimes, firebombings of synagogues, bullets shot at Jewish children's schools, 100 churches burned and vandalized, and now we see sectarian riots on the streets of Brampton. This never happened before this Prime Minister. Does he take ownership for the divisions he's caused and the violence that has resulted?
Order. Colleagues, when asked members, please, especially members from the far end of the House, to please not take the floor unless they are recognized by the Speaker. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, people watching that last answer will know and note the assuredness with which the Leader of the Opposition declared all the causes and the sources of the terrible violence we're seeing, when the reality is he refuses to take the necessary briefings that our security agencies are offering him to understand the threats to Canada. Why won't he get the security clearance necessary to protect Canadians?
Order. Colleagues, it does not do well when on one side of the House is asked to keep quiet, the other side of the House should do the same. All members should do the same. Then I had
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, the government has tabled regulations to cap greenhouse gas emissions. It's a bit complacent because the deadlines are long, extremely long, and it's Quebecers and Canadians who are paying the price. This is going to give polluters a holiday on emissions control, and this regulation is may appear inadequate given the oil and gas lobby here in the House. Could this not be better done through statute? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as a government, we have always chosen to do everything that's necessary to reduce emissions, to protect Canadian prosperity, and to protect Canadians' future. That's why we're moving ahead with a cap on greenhouse gas emissions coming from the oil industry. This is an industry that is making record profits, an industry that already has the technology to reduce emissions, but with this cap, the industry will have to invest to reduce emissions so that everyone does their fair share in reducing emissions and protecting the planet. Now, member for Belleuil-Chambly, instead of considering the green equalization or green banking or funding of green technology, as the Bloc has been advocating for a long time, the Prime Minister himself has said that this is an industry whose profits have skyrocketed since the pandemic. Instead of imposing standards that aren't tough enough, why doesn't he impose tougher standards And that way, he could go before the electorate finally with a bold record on the environment. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I know full well that both the Bloc and we have the same opinion on this. No industry should be allowed to pollute without limit. That's why we have put a cap on greenhouse gas emissions in the oil and gas industry. That industry contributes almost 1/3 of Canada's annual emissions, and so that industry has a greater capacity to reduce our emissions. They're making record profits, so we agree that they should reinvest in technologies that will help reduce emissions and help them do their fair share.
Honourable member from Burnaby South.
Who here doesn't have a family doctor? Well, 5 million Canadians don't. Now, Loblaws owns Maple, and a family doctor working at Maple's will charge you $80 a month per person to see a doctor. Now, things have gotten so bad, this is predatory. The Prime Minister lets you down, and then Galen Weston swoops in to profit off it. Why is this Prime Minister letting Galen Weston profit off of people's pain?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize that it is the provincial area of jurisdiction to deliver health care in this country, but it is the federal responsibility to make sure that that health care remains public and universal and single payer. And that is exactly what we're doing by investing a record $200 billion in health care over the coming years that will oblige the provinces to invest in public health care, to hire more doctors, particularly family doctors, to reduce wait times, and to improve their mental health services. These are things that Canadians expect, including the federal government expecting it of the provinces.
L'honorable député de Burnaby Sud.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South. Private health care is a jungle. It could cost $213 for a minor emergency. It's so profitable that real estate investors are opening private clinics. And the Prime Minister will the Prime Minister finally stand up and put an end to all of this? The Right Honourable Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, unlike the NDP, we understand and respect the fact that the delivery of health care comes under provincial jurisdiction, but the federal government is responsible for ensuring that our healthcare system remains public, and the federal government has to be there to help with the funding. That's why we've put on the table $200 billion in investments for the next 10 years, which will allow for the hiring of more family doctors, reducing wait times, more support for mental health and workers in the system. And that's what all Canadians expect.
The Honourable Member from Calgary, Forest Lawn.
This Liberal NDP Prime Minister presides over the worst GDP per person growth since the Great Depression. And it's no surprise. His high taxes and woke policies like carbon tax scams, job-killing capital gains tax hike, and oil and gas cap have made Canadians poorer. In fact, U.S. GDP grew 2.8% as Canadians' GDP per person declined for 2 years, driving out business, investment, and jobs. Will this Prime Minister axe the tax hikes that make Canadians poorer?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, what the Conservative will talk about is the record level of investment we have seen in the country, Mr. Speaker. But more importantly for Canadians watching at home, people are wondering, Mr. Speaker, they're really wondering, why is the leader of the Conservative not getting his security clearance, Mr. Speaker? What does he have to hide, Mr. Speaker? People on the street of Canada are asking, Mr. Speaker, get the clearance, get the briefing, get on and do your job, man.
The Honourable Member from Calgary, Forest Lawn.
We're talking about the Canadians. They're starving and they want to make personal attacks on the Conservative leader, these economic arsonists will do anything to deflect away from their failed record. Canadian workers are $22,000 poorer than U.S. workers. If Canada had just kept pace with the U.S. over the last 2 years, Canadian workers would have $6,200 more every year. And now Canada is poorer than Alabama. Why don't these economic arsonists call a carbon tax election so Canadian workers can finally fire them?
The Honourable Minister for Diversity, Inclusion and People with Disabilities.
Mr. Speaker, we won't take any lessons from the Conservatives on how to deliver for Canadians. While they keep their headed agenda, Mr. Speaker, we know exactly what they'll do. They'll cut dental care for 9 million Canadians. They'll end $10 a day childcare. They'll cancel the National School Food Program, Mr. Speaker. Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, won't tell you their plan because they don't want Canadians to know. Just like, Mr. Speaker, their leader won't get the security clearance that he needs to protect Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Shame on them. What are they hiding?
The Honourable Member from Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, more bad news from experts. Last week, economists at National Bank released an analysis that said, quote, GDP per capita has fallen by about 4% cumulatively since 2022, which is unprecedented outside a recession. This is a made-in-Canada per person per capita GDP recession caused by a government that's hiked taxes on everything. Energy, housing, banks, investment, that's driving out investment and making Canadians poorer. When will the government admit its mistake and reverse course on tax hikes that are driving out investment, like the reverse course on so many other issues?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, if the Conservatives would like to make comparisons with the United States, I have one for them. Canada ran a deficit of just 1.1% of GDP in 2023, Mr. Speaker. That's compared to a 6.3% of GDP deficit in the United States of America, Mr. Speaker. We have made sure to be responsible with our balance sheet, and we are doing it while supporting vulnerable Canadians, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives' hidden agenda is to cut programs that Canadians rely on.
The Honourable Member from Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, I'll quote another expert relative to Canada's position with the United States. The Governor of the Bank of Canada, who last week said, quote, foreign capital, even some Canadian capital, is going to the United States because they can get faster regulatory approvals, end quote. 2 years ago in Washington, the finance minister in her speech said, quote, Canada must and will show similar generosity in fast-tracking, for example, the energy and mining projects our allies need to heat their homes and to manufacture electric vehicles, end quote. Simple question. Can the government tell us which mining and energy projects they have fast-tracked since the speech in Washington?
The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, I know that member to be an honourable.
I'm going to ask the Honourable Member from Southwest St. Margaret's, please, to not take the floor unless recognized by the Chair. The Honourable Member. The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons from the top.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that member to be someone who cares about Canada's standing in the world and who I thought cared about Canada's national security as well. But what I find perplexing and what I think must be difficult for him to understand is why is it that the leader of the official opposition is refusing to get a security clearance? Why is it that he would rather ignore the threats to Canada's national security? What is it that he's trying to hide, or what is it that he doesn't want to know? The NCCOP reported that a conservative leadership campaign was under threat by foreign actors. Is that something he doesn't want to know about?
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Canadian GDP has declined in 8 of the 9 last quarters. This means Canadians are getting poorer, their quality of life is declining dramatically, and the story is exactly the opposite in the U.S., where there's 2.8% GDP growth. Canadians are facing a recession caused by the Prime Minister's increases in carbon tax, housing tax, and capital gains tax. I know it's hard for the Prime Minister to understand the poverty of Canadians because he's never been in need himself, but can he show some compassion by eliminating his taxes? The Honourable Minister. Canadians have enjoyed record investments. Take Honda, for example, the largest investment in their history, $19 billion. Honda has invested. And the largest investment in BHP's history also, $22 billion in Saskatchewan. Record investments are being made in Canadian companies. Mr. Speaker, Canada is a winner in this century's economy, and we will continue working for Canadians. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Haut-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, how many jobs are Canadians losing because of the quadrupling of the carbon tax, and the job-killing capital gains tax increase as well? Where's the gain, Mr. Speaker? And what we've learned through Statistics Canada is that the income of Canadian households has declined while it's on the increase in the U.S. In Canada, people are having to pay through their teeth. The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Let's talk about investment in my colleague's riding. Affordable housing units are being built as we speak. And the funding for that was questioned by the Conservative leader because he wants to cut back on those deals with the provinces. Would he ask the Conservative leader, who's sitting just 4 seats over for him, if he could get his security clearance so that he can protect all Conservative members against foreign interference? The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Tonight, in the presidential elections, Americans will choose who gets to reopen the North American Free Trade Deal in 2026. Our most important free trade agreement is at risk of being renegotiated. Trump has promised to do that, and Harris voted against CUSMA. That's why it's dangerous to let 2 senators, Peter Boehm and Peter Harder, block C-282. They want to overturn the vote of elected officials to put supply management back on the bargaining table as early as 2026. Is the Prime Minister who appointed them, will he finally ask them to pass C-282 so it's enforced before any renegotiation? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To remind our Bloc colleagues that senators are independent. What he's saying is that the Bloc doesn't have the power to protect supply management. The only government, the only party, the only group of members who has the will and the desire and the ability to protect supply management is a Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. The Prime Minister knows that if C-282 isn't passed, the Americans could put supply management back on the bargaining table as early as 2026. He also knows it won't be him doing the bargaining, it'll be the Conservative leader. If he doesn't act to put C-282 ahead of any negotiation, he's putting our agriculture in the hands of the Conservatives, the same Conservatives who conceded supply management loopholes in agreements with Europe and Asia. Will the Prime Minister intervene, or has he already done so silently? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can assure you that with our Prime Minister, the Minister of International Trade, the Minister of Agriculture, and myself and many of our colleagues, we are talking to senators and we are asking them to get that bill back here quickly. But any legislation can be amended. The best way to protect farmers in Quebec and all across Canada is to ensure that we keep a Liberal government in office for a long time to come. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. The last answer to my last question was yes, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to interrupt the member. I would ask members, please, to allow the member who has the floor to ask his question so that everyone here, including the Speaker, can hear his question. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. From the top, please. It seems that the answer to my last question was yes, Mr. Speaker. No one in this House should tolerate two senators overturning our democratic choice to protect supply management. Message to Misters Beam and Harder. If you want to sacrifice supply management, then run for office. Face the voters for once instead of cashing checks for life in the Senate. Come and present your ideas to farmers in Berthier-Masquinongé. Come and face me. The Liberals are looking for candidates. Will the Prime Minister finally tell them to put their faces on election signs or mind their own business? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Worst way, Mr. Speaker, to defend supply management is to align with the Conservative Party and vote along with them. They're the ones who pose the greatest risk, the greatest threat to supply management. We're the ones who stood up and defended it against the U.S. And unfortunately, what the Bloc is doing is getting in cahoots with the Conservatives.
Honourable Member from Prince George, Northern Rockies.
After 9 years and 3 U.S. presidents, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister has failed to get a deal with the Americans on softwood lumber, while our previous Conservative government got it done within 80 days. 2 more mills in BC are closing because of this Prime Minister's incompetence. Wayne and Marie Harder have seen their logging businesses in Fort St. John destroyed by these NDP Liberals. I asked Wayne yesterday, who would you fire in this NDP Liberal government? Wayne's answer, all of them. Will the Prime Minister do the right thing for forestry families and call an election today?
I'm going to ask once again the colleagues at the end, particularly the member from New Westminster, Burnaby, and Timmins St. James, Bay James, to please not take the floor unless recognized by the Speaker. The Honourable Minister for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, I want to say to forestry industry workers and those in the sector how important they are to Canada, how important they are to Canada's economy, and indeed how important they are to building affordable homes in this country. I know that we continue to work very hard and we have said that getting a deal is indeed the best way to go, but I think what Canadians want to know is why it is that on this side of the House, when we renegotiated NAFTA, on this side of the House, when we stood up to defend tariffs against steel and aluminum workers, or on this side of the House, we are always standing up for workers, what they are doing on the other side of the House.
The Honourable Member for Miramichi, Grand Lake.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, the NDP Liberals are not worth the cost to Canada's economy. While the Prime Minister dismissed his failure on softwood lumber as a small issue, the U.S. slapped a 14.5% tariff on Canada. This negatively impacts the 24,000 New Brunswick forestry workers. The Prime Minister has failed with 3 straight U.S. presidents, while Prime Minister Harper got a deal in just 80 days. When will the Prime Minister finally stand up for New Brunswick forestry workers?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We on this side of the House have been working very hard in the interests of forestry workers and forestry companies here in Canada. We are working very hard to progress negotiations with the Americans. We are working very hard on value-added forestry. It is something that we are committed to continuing to do, including working with Irving Forest Products in New Brunswick. I would say, though, that on this side of the House, we are working very hard in the best interests of Canadians. We would expect elected officials across the board to be doing that, and Canadians are asking why the Leader of the Opposition will not get his security clearance.
The Honourable Member from Prince Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 9 years, the NDP Liberals are not worth the cost. Just weeks after the U.S. hit Canada with a 14.5% tariff on softwood lumber, this Prime Minister dismissed its failures and the impact on Canadian workers and the impact of our forestry sector as small issues. Since the PM's comments in New York City, 2 sawmills in BC have closed, putting over 500 workers out of work. Canadian producers have paid $9 billion in tariffs to the U.S. From softwood lumber to Buy America. Why has this Prime Minister repeatedly backed down to the U.S.?
The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government always stands up for Canadian workers and it always stands up for Canadian industry. When it came to renegotiating NAFTA, we stood strong and protected Canada's economy, while the Conservative Party of Canada said to capitulate. When it came to supporting our steel and aluminum workers, we stood against those tariffs. We hit back hard. What did the other side say, Mr. Speaker? The Conservative Party of Canada said capitulate. Right. When it comes to standing up for Canada's national security, we will always do that. But what about the Conservative Party of Canada? Mr. Speaker, their leader won't even get a security clearance to know what's really going on. What is it he's trying to hide? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Lefort. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Liberal government and 3 American presidents, we still don't have a softwood lumber agreement with the United States. While the previous Conservative Prime Minister got a solution at 90 days after being elected, the incompetence and lack of leadership from this Prime Minister means we don't have a deal. 3 sawmills have filmed recently in Quebec, including one in my riding. 100 workers have been let go. Why are the Liberals still abandoning forestry workers? The Honourable Minister of Innovation. Mr. Speaker, I have a lot of respect for my colleague, and he knows that we've always stood up for the forestry sector and its workers. But the real question, Mr. Speaker, that Canadians are asking today, the real question they're asking is, why is the Conservative leader not getting his security clearance? Why, Mr. Speaker? What is he hiding from Canadians, Mr. Speaker? That's the real question of the day. That's the elephant in the room, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative leader needs to get the security clearance. He'll get the briefings then, and then he'll be able to do his work, because that's what Canadians expect from a leader. They expect them to get a security clearance.
The Honourable Member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Mr. Speaker, women veterans will be attending Remembrance Day services this week. Despite their courage and dedication, many of them will be asked if the medals they are wearing belong to their husbands or sons. Women veterans and their loved ones have sacrificed so much for our country. They cannot be made invisible. Will the minister make sure the organizers of the National Remembrance Day ceremony include women veterans, giving them the respect they deserve?
Then I have
the Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, today being the first day of Veterans Week, I first of all want to take a moment to thank all the men and women that served in the Canadian Armed Forces and continue to serve with bravery. We owe them a debt of gratitude. As we attend Remembrance Day services all through Canada, we certainly want to make sure that Canadians have a moment to really thank the veterans that have served. I also encourage them to attend Legions and also many commemorative services that will take place all over Canada to thank both men and women that have served in the Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from London, Fanshawe.
For 17 years, the Office of the Veteran Ombuds has been shining a light on the neglect of veterans. We have a sacred obligation to care for those who served, but successive Liberal and Conservative governments have ignored their reports and recommendations. Veterans need action, and we need to empower the Ombuds by giving them the power to compel documents and issue binding recommendations. When will the Liberals make the necessary changes to create a truly independent Ombuds so she can be the champion veterans deserve?
The Honourable Minister for Veterans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the services that we provided to veterans across this country, since 2016, our government has invested more than $11.5 billion in additional services and support to help our veterans and their families. Unlike the previous Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, we have acted. The previous Conservative government closed Veterans Affairs offices across this country. And the first thing that we did, we reopened all 9 offices, plus we opened an additional one. They also slashed the public service by 1,000 people, Mr. Speaker, public servants that provided direct supports to veterans. We will absolutely always be there for veterans and their families, Mr. Speaker.
Bravo.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacolle. Mr. Speaker, our government has an ambitious plan when it comes to housing. Fighting homelessness, making home buying more accessible with the First Home Savings Account, putting federal land on the market for housing and supporting co-ops. Can the Minister of Economic Development for Quebec please tell us how these measures will increase access to housing around the country and increase housing stock across the country? The Honourable Minister of Economic Development for Quebec. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Housing Accelerator Fund is going to help to build thousands of social and affordable housing units. Even Conservative MPs know it, and they've written to the Housing Minister to ask to access that program in their own ridings. The irresponsible plan from the Conservative leader to cut investments is going to endanger 8,000 accessible housing units in Quebec, Mr. Speaker. We can't trust a leader who's offering just cuts and slogans, but especially who isn't getting his security clearance so that he can protect Canadians from the dangers that we face.
The honourable member from Battleford's Lloydminster.
After 9 years of the NDP Liberals, the majority of young Canadians have now abandoned the dream of home ownership. While housing starts fail to keep up with Canada's population growth, the Americans are building 4 times more housing per new resident. Conservatives have announced a plan to axe the federal sales tax on new homes, and we have called on the provinces to do the same. Our plan means more housing and savings for young Canadians who are desperately trying to enter the housing market. Will the NDP Liberals reignite the dream of homeownership and axe the federal GST on housing?
Here. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
The list is growing, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday we learned in the Toronto Star that the MP for Kamloops on the Conservative side has joined many other Conservative colleagues to advocate for programs that their leader wants to cut. Programs like the Housing Accelerator Fund that are going to lead to more home building in his community and communities across the country, Mr. Speaker. They want to make these cuts. They have no vision on housing. Therefore, they have no vision on the future for Canada, Mr. Speaker. It's nuts.
I ask the honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou, as well as the member for Coast of Bays Central Notre Dame to please not take the floor unless they are recognized by the Speaker. I thank the honourable members. The honourable member from Battleford's Lloydminster.
Speaker, that wannabe minister is so desperately clinging onto their $8 billion failed Liberal housing photo op program that has built 0 houses. The most significant housing policy commitment made in the past 2 decades. And those aren't my words, Mr. Speaker. That's what the West End Home Builders Association has said. And the Canadian Real Estate Association also called it a positive step towards making home ownership more attainable for Canadians. Will the NDP Liberals listen to the experts and axe the federal sales tax on housing?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
It's a difficult subject for them, Mr. Speaker, obviously. The MP for Kamloops, the MP for Simcoe North, the MP for Central Okanagan, the MP, and he's the best friend of the Conservative leader, the MP for St. Albert Edmonton, Mr. Speaker, went behind the back of the Conservative leader to advocate for the Accelerator Fund that's going to lead to more home building. In this House of Commons, on social media, they parrot their leaders' talking points, but they don't believe in those talking points, evidently, Mr. Speaker, because they're advocating for good government programs that are going to get more homes built for Canadians.
The order, please. The honourable member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, the 2 leaders of the Liberal Bloc Party aren't worth the cost of housing, but the common sense Conservatives will axe the GST on new home sales. For an $800,000 home, which cost only $400,000 when our leader was housing minister, that will allow buyers to save $40,000. That's $2,200 per year in mortgage payments, Mr. Speaker. When will the 2 leaders of the Liberal Bloc Party axe the federal tax on housing, or are they going to continue to fund their photo op programs? The Honourable Minister of Economic Development for Quebec. Well, I would like to share with my honourable colleague a simple mathematical rule, Mr. Speaker. It's very simple. 6 is lower than 8,000. And that's the number of homes that the Conservative leader is putting in danger. 8,000 with his cuts. He needs to answer to Quebecers. Why won't he do it? I would invite all members, including ministers and leaders of the opposition parties, to take their conversations outside of the House, please. The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals' failures in housing have been resounding, Mr. Speaker. The two leaders of the Liberal Bloc Party have doubled the cost of housing, rent, and down payments. Because the Liberals' record is such a disaster, the common sense Conservatives will cut $8 billion in failed, ineffective Liberal housing programs. Mr. Speaker, when the Conservative leader was Minister of Housing, he built 195,000 new homes. And we have the receipts. Why are the two leaders of the Liberal Bloc Party so far to the left that they've left Canadians behind when it comes to housing? The Honourable Minister of Economic Development for Quebec. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to know how my honourable colleague can say to his constituents how they are going to cut the 80 housing units that are planned for his riding under the Housing Accelerator Fund. But his constituents also want to know why the Conservative leader doesn't want to get his security clearance and protect Canada's democratic integrity, the integrity of his own party. The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. The Liberals promised a major reform of EI in 2015, then again in 2019, then in 2021, and then no later than 2022 promised, and then by Christmas 2022, pinky swear. 9 years, 4 ministers later, the Liberals have done nothing. EI is still failing 6 out of 10 workers. That's why the Bloc Québécois has tabled a bill to reform EI, and it's going to fix these inequalities. Will the Liberals support it? The Honourable Minister for Economic Development. Well, Mr. Speaker, I have a lot of respect for my colleague from the Bloc Québécois, and when it comes to the question of modernizing the employment insurance program, that's a priority for our government, and we have made major changes, Mr. Speaker. We've extended the illness benefits to 26 weeks. We have extended the 5 weeks of additional support for seasonal workers, Mr. Speaker. We've also added important benefits for adoptive parents, and we are going to continue to modernize the EI system for all Canadians from coast to coast to coast. The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. With C418, the Bloc is moving forward where the Liberals have failed since 2015. We are proposing a single eligibility criteria at 420 hours. Increased benefits from 55 to 60%, increasing the minimum benefit period to 35 weeks, increasing special illness benefits to 50 weeks, and the list goes on. That's what a real reform looks like. Will the Liberals support us? The Honourable Minister of Employment. Well, Mr. Speaker, there's a gang who want to support us in continuing to modernize the EI system. We've heard loud and clear at our summit on the labour force for the 21st century. Listen, I understand that the Bloc Québécois wants to move forward with certain ideas here in the House, but are they going to disassociate from their friends, the Conservatives, and support us so that we can get back to work, the very important work that we need to get done here in the House of Commons? That's the question of the day.
The Honourable Member from Hastings, Lennox-Naddington.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of NDP Liberals, they are not worth the cost of housing, and the majority of young Canadians are pointing to this government's failure to manage the economy as the reason their dreams of home ownership are dashed. The Conservatives have a plan. Scrapping the GST on new home sales will save young Canadians tens of thousands of dollars on new homes, and the Conservative leader already wrote the premiers asking them to match his pledge provincially. Mr. Speaker, will the NDP Liberals axe the federal GST on housing so more young Canadians can afford a home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I've answered the matter already, and on this issue of housing, she ought to look one seat ahead of her to the MP for Peterborough. Earlier today, there was a 2-hour filibuster in the House of Commons committee responsible for housing, where we could have actually talked about housing, but we had to listen to the Conservatives filibuster for 2 hours, as I say, because they were trying to defend their colleague, who only a few days ago said that homelessness and homeless people and poverty lead to crime inevitably, Mr. Speaker. They made a natural connection between the two, blaming the poor for crime in Canada. It's unacceptable. We got to deal with stigma, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lennox, Hastings and Addington.
Let me be clear and call out the facts on the failures of these Liberals. The Liberals' own housing advisor said it was hard to deny that the Housing Accelerator Fund is turning out to be nothing more than a heist of tax dollars flowing from the feds to the municipalities. In contrast, the Conservative plan will apply to every single new home build, regardless if it's in downtown Toronto or in Bancroft. The Conservative plan will take power from the pens of bureaucrats to the hammers of builders. Mr. Speaker, will this government endorse the Conservative plan to scrap the GST on housing? Yes or no?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
More empty slogans from the Conservative side, Mr. Speaker. But you know what's not empty? You know what's real? The example of the Conservative leader who only months ago went down to encampments and filled people in their most vulnerable state. Right. Who before that visited a home of a working class person, a server, and called it a shack, Mr. Speaker. Yep. So is it any surprise that the MP for Peterborough looks at poverty as something that's caused by those on the street, that points to the poor and makes them responsible for issues of criminality? We have to deal with stigma if we're going to deal with the homelessness crisis. They're not serious, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Kamloops, Thompson and Caribou.
There was chaos, yelling, screaming, running for cover. And no, Mr. Speaker, I'm not talking about the last Liberal caucus meeting. I'm talking about a police chase that happened in downtown Toronto. It looked like the scene from a movie. Police chasing two people reportedly on bail. Rather than take accountability, this minister's response, do this, blame other people, blame the provinces. When will the Prime Minister and this Justice Minister stand in their place and take accountability for their failed catch and release policy?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk about accountability. There are currently 700 fewer police officers working in the City of Toronto today than when I was the police chief only 9 years ago. Mr. Speaker, there's been a 23% reduction in police per population in Toronto over those 9 years. And Mr. Speaker, how did that happen? 2 consecutive Conservative mayors, under the unwatchful eye of a Conservative premier, allowed a hiring freeze and those cuts to take place. If you want to look for accountability, look in the mirror.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Ottawa-Vanier. Mr. Speaker, through the First and Second World Wars, over 300,000 Canadians in uniform left Halifax to go to Europe. Canada has hundreds of thousands of veterans, all of whom have their own specific experience. Every year, Veterans Week is the opportunity to reaffirm that as Canadians, we have the duty to remember the sacrifices that those who have served made, and that those who continue to serve continue to make. Can the Minister of Veterans Affairs please inform this House about the theme of Veterans Week this year? The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs. I'd like to thank my colleague from Ottawa-Vanier for her important question and for her hard work for our veterans and their families. The theme of Veterans Week this year is Canadian Armed Forces Around the World. It's a theme that reflects the role that Canada has long played in promoting and defending peace and security around the world. Mr. Speaker.
Canadians across the country to either attend Legions this week, to thank a veteran, and also to make sure that they take part in a commemorative service in their community. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker.
Bravo. The honourable member from Leeds Grenville, Thousand Islands and Vita Lakes.
The Liberals' $9 million cover-up of their luxury condo purchase in New York City is now unraveling. Newly uncovered government documents show that the Prime Minister's media pal, Tom Clark, lied before a parliamentary committee. He had previously said that he didn't weigh in on the purchase, but now we know he in fact said that it required urgent replacement. After 9 years of these NDP Liberals, they're not worth the cost, the corruption, or lies from their insiders. So will the Prime Minister fire his buddy, Tom Clark, for lying to Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I just went to the OGO committee and I answered all his questions for an hour, and we've been talking about this issue. First and foremost, we have good value for money in this transaction. $7 million will be refunded. Second, all the process were, of course, followed. And finally, we don't fall into the character assassination that he's doing about an important consul. But not only that, at the time of the U.S. election today, when all Canadians are looking down south to see what's going to happen, we need to invest in the American-Canadian relationship, and that's exactly what we're doing, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Leeds Grenville, Thousand Islands and Vito Lakes.
These economic vandals bought a $9 million condo in Manhattan for the Prime Minister's buddy, and they're subsidizing his rent to the tune of $40,000 per month after doubling rents for Canadians, doubling mortgages for Canadians, and presiding over a country for 9 years with homeless encampments springing up under bridges in communities from coast to coast to coast. If that's not bad enough, Canadians are lined up at food banks in record numbers. 25% of Canadians know where their next meal is coming from. If they won't fire Clark for lying, will they fire him for blowing $9 million?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Apparently, Mr. Clark was good enough for the Conservative when he was moderating their leadership race, but that's another issue. That's another issue, Mr. Speaker. What I want to say today is, as Canadians are looking down south to see what's going on and to take act of the will of the American people, we will invest in the relationship between Canada and the U.S., contrary to what the Conservatives want to do. And of course, we won't take the recommendation of having an official residence outside of Manhattan. Why? Because only 2 countries in the world do so, Bangladesh and Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from... Order. That includes the honourable member from South Shore, St. Margaret's. The honourable member from Calgary, Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, Tom Clark lied to committee, saying that he didn't know about the purchase of a $9 million condo. The Minister of Foreign Affairs also said she didn't know about the purchase of a $9 million condo. She also said she didn't know that a Canadian warship was next to Russian warships in the port of Havana. She also said that she didn't know that a senior global affairs official attended a Russian embassy party. Mr. Speaker, isn't that the role of the Minister of Foreign Affairs to know?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
I know I have a lot of time for the member opposite because she used to be the consul in Dallas, and she knows how much it's important to be investing in her diplomatic network in the U.S. So of course, we'll continue to do so. We'll continue to invest across our continent, across also the U.S., because if there's one country in the world who knows about the Americans, who knows about the U.S., it's Canada.
The honourable member from Richmond Centre.
Mr. Speaker, previous Conservative government has brought cuts and challenges that left many veterans struggling, particularly in British Columbia, and we don't want to see this happen again. Our Liberal government has worked diligently to address these issues. As we reflect on these changes, let us remember that our commitment to veterans must be unwavering. Can the Minister of Citizen Services share how our government has expanded our reach to better support veterans from coast to coast to coast?
The Honourable Minister from Citizen Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Do you remember when the Conservatives campaigned on shutting down veterans' offices? Yep. Or do you remember when they promised to increase the retirement age to 67? Well, of course you don't, because Conservatives never actually say what they're actually going to do. It's why they speak in slogans. They hope no one would notice that they shut down veterans' offices in Corner Brook, Sydney, Charlottetown, Thunder Bay, Windsor, Saskatoon, Brandon, Kelowna, and Prince George. Mr. Speaker, our government reopened all those offices, and we opened a new office in Surrey, because when we say that we support veterans, unlike Conservatives, we actually mean it.
The Honourable Member from Windsor West.
Mr. Speaker, Windsor is being abused and taken for granted by the Liberals yet again. It's a sad state that the city must sue the federal government to recoup the cost of the Ambassador Bridge blockade. While the Conservatives supported this illegal activity that hurt the economy and public safety, the Liberals are making Windsor taxpayers foot the bill. This means less money for roads, parks, housing, and emergency services. Less services for Windsor because of Liberal failures. Instead of forcing Windsor to fight in court, will this government repay the city and finally take responsibility for federal border costs as they should?
The Honourable Minister for Public Security.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank our colleague from Windsor for that important question. He's right. At a time when the Conservatives were supporting the illegal acts of the convoy, the City of Windsor and the Province of Ontario were partners with the Government of Canada in trying to bring this horrible crisis to a peaceful conclusion. I was happy some months ago to have an opportunity to talk to the Mayor of Windsor. My colleagues on this side of the House have also been talking to me about what we can do to support the City of Windsor. And Mr. Speaker, we're always open to working with the City of Windsor. They've been a valuable partner to our government.
The Honourable Member from Courtenay, Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, INEO Employment in Port Alberni provides vital support to help people trying to find jobs. They offer necessary training and capacity building for employment readiness. They can do this because of the BC Community and Employer Partnerships Program, but they've recently lost support due to federal funding cuts. Funding cuts that are happening because the Liberal slashed BC's funding by $74 million. They're leaving people out to dry. But while they do everything they can to continue to prop up rich CEOs, will the Liberals immediately restore BC's federal funding to make sure that these critical programs keep running?
The Honourable Minister for Employment and Workforce Development.
I'm happy to report to this House that the Government of Canada transfers $2.8 billion every year to train almost 1 million workers in partnerships that we have with British Columbia, provinces and territories across the country. If that member and other members in this House want to make sure that we have a fully functioning workforce, let's get the provinces to do their part when it comes to recognizing foreign credentials. We have thousands of people in this country who need to make sure that the credentials are recognized here. We need the provinces to do their part and make sure that people don't have survival jobs in this country, but they have dignified jobs from coast to coast to coast.
Commonly